So we do have a slide deck that we're going to use to sort of organize the conversation today, but we really want this to be interactive, and OGP is super happy to host, but please don't think of this as an OGP session. We really want it to be for the community to share ideas and possibly challenges and other things when it comes to storytelling. We know a lot of people have put a focus on it and have tried some different things. So we'd love to hear about it. It's obviously been somewhat challenging during the pandemic, but also some good lessons learned. So again, feel free to go ahead and put questions in the chat and we'll answer them. And we're going to do some work on some Jamboards and others to share ideas and move forward. But I thought we would get started. When it comes to storytelling, there's never just one way to do it. So I always like to bring in some outside voices to talk about the work that they do. And we have Rowan Emslie with us today, who works on climate change, actually, which is also an issue that can be challenging to communicate in the very short bits of information people tend to pay attention to today. So we thought we'd hear some lessons from how they're really tackling this issue and coming up with some innovative ways to engage people. So I'll turn it over to Rowan to get started. And again, any questions or other things along the way, just go ahead and stick them in the chat and we'll make sure we ask them to Rowan.
Great, thanks so much, Stephanie. Yes, as Stephanie mentioned, I work on climate communications. I work for Clean Air Task Force, where I head up communications in Europe. We are a global nonprofit focused on rapid decarbonization of the entire economy. It started in the US, it spread to Europe and Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Not quite as many places as OGP, but we're still trying to cover off a lot of different countries and contexts, which I think hopefully means I have some sort of useful things to say for you guys. Now, as an organization, our primary focus is on changing climate policy. Fundamentally, we think that's the strongest lever to pull. And that means ultimately we would like to be doing the nitty-gritty work of writing better climate legislation wherever it is we work. But that's really the end. We've already succeeded if we're actually writing policy with or for policymakers, and communications generally, but also storytelling is those are the tools that we use to get to that end point. The big issue, I think, for us, and I think this is always true, particularly for open government movements, is that the topic that we are focused on is very complicated. It requires a certain amount of knowledge about not just the topic area itself. So you need to know about the science of climate change and how the atmosphere works, but also you need to understand the sort of ecosystem in which policy is made, which is its own complicated sort of Byzantine labyrinth of things that you can get into. And I think this probably sounds familiar to a lot of people listening. So there's lots of complexity built in. Now, because we want to mostly change policy, we are mostly focused on, oh, there's a phone, okay. We are mostly focused on actually reaching the policymakers and trying to change their minds about things. One of the other problems is we aren't the only people trying to do that. There's only so many policymakers, right? In Brussels, it's 600, maybe 800 people who make decisions, and everyone wants to reach the same 600, maybe 800 people. So even though we think, obviously, our topic is extremely important, and that's why we're working on it, and we have all this research, and we have scientists, very smart people, a lot of other people also think the same thing, right? So I think that's kind of my one big thing that I have to say over and over and over is that attention is limited. And that is true for us in our everyday lives, but also for the policymakers, even more so for policymakers. So whenever we go to a policymaker, I always say we have to answer two questions as soon as possible, which is why this and why now? So why this topic instead of all the other topics that I could be talking about? Why should I care about this thing? And then why do I have to do something about this right now, right? Because you can get actually quite often, and we find this all the time, when we are talking to policymakers and we say, hey, we need to figure out the technologies that are going to replace the existing technologies for our energy system. We need to find ways to make them, get them built and understand how they work and scale them. And everyone says, okay, yeah, that sounds good. But we're going to deal with that a little bit later on. Right now, we have to clean up, the electricity grid or something a little bit more near term. So they kind of park it. So you need to have an urgency all the time in whatever you're communicating, and stories can really help with that. And then underneath those two questions is actually brand and reputation. And I think, I've worked in NGOs and in the corporate world and startups. Very often NGOs don't think about their brand. It's seen as like kind of a dirty word for like consultants and startup people, but it's your reputation, right? So if you come into the room and you start trying to make an argument and it's a great argument, you tell a really compelling story about why it has to happen right now. If no one knows who you are, or they see you as fundamentally untrustworthy or in some other way against them, they're still not going to listen to your great story. So brand and reputation, very important, and I think maybe a bit ignored. And I guess that's the why you, right? So why this, why now, why you? So as I mentioned, we work on really super technical topics. We specifically focus on the bits of the climate conversation that we feel aren't being examined enough. So when I say to people in a party or whatever, I work on climate change, people will ask me about, renewable energies, offshore wind farms or something like that. And I say, actually, we don't work on that because that's lots of people working on this. We think it's covered. So I normally can't assume that people even know the area of the policy world that we're working on. That means there's a lot of extra legwork. So you have to do a lot of the educating before you can actually talk about your points. And this is often where stories really come into it. So we kind of do this in three stages here. And this is such a comms person thing to say, but you start with your audience, right? What do they actually care about? What do they need to know? What do they need to go towards your goal, right? Sometimes, and we get requests from this, sometimes from government, they ask us, hey, we are trying to do something on whatever it is, methane emissions, but governments are complicated things, there's bureaucracy, it takes a while to get things going. We need a bit of external pressure because that'll help us grease the wheels internally. And so that means we have to go out and make a story happen in the press, make some sort of a scandal, quote unquote, to get things moving from the outside. Sometimes that is what is needed to push things forward. Sometimes it's a specific study and an explanation of that study. So they'll say, how does this affect jobs in my region? And if you don't have the answers, they can't move forwards. So it's really understanding your audience and what they need, and then zeroing in on that. The second part, and I say this all the time, I work with, nuclear physicists and atmospheric chemists and people whose jobs I didn't even know existed before I started working with them. They're experts, they're highly expert. They've been doing the same thing for a very long time. They know a lot about that particular topic. Many of them, many people in general, but especially experts, want to skip to the end where you just make the argument. And I'm always saying, no, first of all, you have to tell them why this is an important thing to think about. And then you have to explain to them how the information that you got, how this information came about and why they should trust it. And then you have to explain what can be done. And then you have to explain, you can't just go straight to, here's the policy that we need, because no one's going to care about that. So again, I think about this as a funnel for every audience member, and they start from ignorant to engaged. And you have to push them through that funnel with different types of content. Sometimes, the first thing might be sometimes we just do background chats with policymakers. It might just be a very short blog post that does an outline. It might even be like an FAQ that will pop up in a Google search, right? Something introductory. And then as they go through, you can get more and more intense. And often as you go through the funnel, you can bring in more specific examples and specific stories. So we'll tell a story about, a industrial facility in Germany that wants to clean up how it produces steel, but it can't do that because of all these different reasons. But it's difficult to get to that. So yeah, you can't skip to the end. And then you have to make it seem like the story is everywhere all the time. And maybe you might get it so that the story is everywhere all the time. But again, very often we live in our little tunnels and we think the story is everywhere and it's very convincing and it's very important. But outside of our little bubble, it doesn't mean so much like that. So I think of this as how many different times can you get your audience to come across your story? Because the more somebody sees it, the more likely they are to remember it and remember the important parts from it. You can't just go, here's a launch, here's a paper, we're done. So let me give you an example. So we work on methane, which is another greenhouse gas, often forgotten. In the world of climate change, people talk about CO2 and carbon dioxide, and everything's measured, in fact, in CO2 standards. But there is this other greenhouse gas and also several other ones, but particularly methane, which is highly pollutant, 80 times more pollutant than CO2. Now, when we started working on this, well, I say when the organization started working on this in 2001, it was as a result of the first scientific paper, which was flagging that methane might have an issue. And at that time, even the scientific community didn't really understand it. So we went and asked science, did a bunch of research and started explaining that research to policymakers and to other NGOs. And at first, everybody said, this is a distraction, right? We need to focus on CO2. We can't be talking about this other greenhouse gas. It's too complicated, it's too confusing. And at first, I think we agreed. Then the evidence came again and again and again, and we got more and more concerned. And then we said, no, actually, we have to break away from what other people are doing. So when I started working on it in 2020 in Europe, no policymakers didn't even know what methane was most of the time, when we came to talk to them. And if they did know what it was, they hadn't connected it to climate. And even if they had done that, they just thought about cows burping. So it was really an uphill battle. And again, what we found was people our experts were going, we've been working on this for 20 years, here's all the science. But evidence doesn't help if no one understands what you're talking about. So what we did in terms of advocacy was actually try to show people this invisible gas, right? So we got a special camera that can film methane emissions coming out of oil and gas facilities. Now, methane is about 70 to 80% of the natural gas that is likely in your homes right now. It is piped all over Europe. We don't produce a lot of it here, but it is piped all over the place and used in our houses and all over the place. And it leaks. It leaks all the time in those pipes. It leaks in your stove. It leaks in the storage facilities that you see normally in the edge of town. And the reason for that is it's not regulated. There is no reason for the companies to do anything about those leaks because policymakers have ignored it, basically. So what we wanted to show was this is a problem here, and it's a problem that affects everybody all over the place. So we got a guy, special camera, he went out filming these methane emissions. And it's like an infrared camera, so it shows these kind of ethereal shots of the plumes coming out. And then you can label it and you can point it out. And you can show them the shot of a normal place, doesn't look like anything's coming out, and then you switch to this other camera, and then you see that there's this silent, deadly gas coming out. Now, the good thing about that is it brings something to life, and people they start to demystify the topic to some extent. So the visuals really help. The other part of it is that actually we made a story out of the guy with the camera. So it was almost like a road trip story with him going around Europe discovering these things. So you could follow along with him how he was discovering these things and being shocked that he just kept finding them over and over and over. So that also really helped. We kind of gave it a character that people can follow. And he's been interviewed in 20 different countries and on all over the place. So he just keeps popping up over and over and over. The other good thing about this camera, the visual, is that it surprised people, right? You could show somebody something that looks innocuous, and then you go, actually, here's all this problem. And then that sense of surprise gets people out of the, that attention space where they go, why should I bother thinking about this? The surprise element makes them want to know more. And then finally, it was all about making it local. So we would always produce a new report for, press toolkit with all the timestamps and the videos and everything for everything in your country, right? Spain, here's everything. Denmark, here's everything. Germany, here's everything. And then we'd relate it specifically often to a local partner who could talk about the lack of regulation. And that's a bit of a scandal. And then finally, we could relate it to research around the health impacts of methane leaks. So there's a personal element as well. If you live anywhere near a big facility that's leaking methane, there will be health consequences there as well. So it was about making it tangible and about shocking people and surprising them that no one was doing something about this. And then, of course, actually, the nice thing about methane is that we had solutions. So then we said, here are the solutions. This is what policymakers need to do. It's very simple. But we had to take people on that journey to get there. I think I'm out of time.
Yeah, no, Rowan is great. And the reason we had Rowan here today is we've got a complicated topic that people don't know about. It doesn't really lend itself to a lot of the elements of storytelling that we're going to talk about today, particularly character and context. So I think the way they approached this was super interesting in helping people figure out how it relates to them and then putting a face on the problem that people can relate to. So we're going to dig into that. But first, I'm going to turn it over quickly to my colleague, Marissa, just to introduce the Open Stories Project, and then we'll kind of dig into the stories that you all, or most of you, started to submit with your story chart. So Marissa.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Maya, if you're able to share the presentation, we'll start there. So yeah, thanks, Rowan, for the great presentation. And I think this all segues nicely into kind of introducing the Open Stories Project for those of you who aren't familiar. OGP launched this last year as part of our 10th anniversary, but the goal of it was really to build it for the community. It's not just about OGP, it's about the whole OpenGov community, and giving a place for you all to share your stories and also to find other stories from, other government reformers, civil society activists, citizens working on these issues, to know, really share knowledge amongst each other and inspire each other as well. So this workshop we're doing today is kind of the first of hopefully more types of resources that the OGP Comms team wants to build out for this community in partnership with some of the other, communications teams, the other organizations in the OpenGov community. So we really want this to be interactive. Please feel free to jump into the chat. We'll be doing a Jamboard as well, to kind of, gain your insights throughout. So there's no stupid questions. Please engage with us and, think through if there are other resources that would be useful as you all are trying to build out your stories. We really, we're trying to kind of start these workshops to just build capacity in the community, because we know there's lots of stories to be told and everyone is busy and they're, staff is tight, budgets are tight, but there's a lot of capacity we can do to build up our own skill set and tell stronger stories, to promote the Open Gov mission. So if we can drop the Jamboard in the chat, it might already be there. We'll just kind of walk you through quickly, just for those of you that aren't familiar with it. We're going to go through kind of 5 different elements of storytelling, and this is really keeping in mind the Open Gov community and Open Gov stories. So since we launched Open Stories, we've gotten a lot of submissions. We've seen we did the Your Story short form that many of you filled out. So a lot of what we're talking about today is just kind of what we've seen and what we think might be, some of the challenges that the community is facing, and some interesting ways we've seen people do to address those. So there's just 4 slides in here with the different categories that we'll be talking about: character, context, conflict, conclusion, and then we'll close with craft, which is just kind of some tips on overall story generation, so that won't have its own Jamboard. But yeah, if you have any questions about how to use the Jamboard throughout the presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat. But you just add little sticky notes and can add your opinions throughout. We'll kind of stop periodically and review. Lovely test there from Maya. Awesome. And as you're thinking, as we're going through the presentation, we really want to just make sure that this is for you, this is interactive. And so as we're kind of going through these elements, really just think through, how do these elements apply to your story? If you came here today with a story that you are working on with Your Story short, and you want to develop it further, think about that story. If there's another reform that you're working on, you're implementing it, or you just finished, it'll be really helpful to have an actual story in mind as we're digging through this, so you can kind of dig into that a bit further. I think we can go back to the presentation then, Maya, and Stephanie will kick us off with character.
Yeah, we're going to start with character. And these was one of the first questions that we put into Your Story short. And we did that very deliberately because we know it's a challenge when working on open government stories to really find the person that you can talk about are persons. As Rowan said, they had methane and they came up with, I'm going to call him Methane Man to kind of put a human touch on it. This photo here is a woman named Mabel. And when we wanted to talk about gender in Argentina and many of the advancements they were making, a lot of them were very technical in terms of gender analysis and other things. We actually found Mabel here, who has been an activist for 50, 60 years and could really speak with passion about the issue and talk about what it means to people. So she was the character that we ended up telling the story about. So when we talk about this internally, instead of saying, we have a story on gender advancements in Argentina, we say we have Mabel's story. So we're able to use her. And we go out to the next slide. And, that is really important because the characters help us show that open government, for all the technical parts of it, is really about people. It allows someone to have someone to connect to in the story, so you can be inspired by what they do. Oftentimes when you're doing these interviews, they'll say something, quotes or other things that are very inspirational and very motivating to people. So you can really, if you can find the character, really help develop the story. And from what we've seen, from what you all send in from Your Story short, and what we've seen in our work, is we can go to the next slide, is there's kind of 3 types of characters that we see developing in the story. The first is, is there a government reformer, someone who's maybe doing business differently than before, or really pushing forward? Can you tell his or her or their story? Why are they doing it? How are they going about it? There's obviously civil society activists. It's what many of you are, it looks like, on the call today. Again, why are they doing it? How are they doing it? It even could be you that are the character in your story, talking about your work. And then finally, there's the citizens that are involved. Maybe they're helping to implement a citizen audit or they're citizens that are actually impacted by the reform in the end of the day. So we wanted to take a minute, and we'll be kind of putting some of our thoughts on this too with the Jamboard, for all of you to kind of put in there what character it is that you're really thinking about for their story, and what kind of unique quality may they have. So I think, Maya, we can go to the Jamboard.
So just as a reminder, on the left side here where my arrows, you can pick up a little sticky note like this, and you can also change the color and just type whatever you're thinking of in there, and then drag it around to place it.
So I see government reformers. And when you think about the characters, you know, also sometimes when I do this, it really helps to give them a name, or they have a name, or to sort of use their name and start talking about how it's their story. So civil society organized citizens monitoring how services are delivered. Citizen monitoring is something we've done some stories on, and those tend to turn out good. You tend to get a lot of good information about why they're doing it and why it's something that's personal to them. Village administrator, it's a good one. Parliaments, it's an interesting one. Academic institutions, yeah. Investigative journalists, we've done some stories on that. Those are good ones. But even within these broader categories, you know, how do we then, and it takes some work. We know that from our own experience, really trying to help, once you kind of figure out how you want to tell your story, really digging around to find that person who can be really good at telling it. So these are great, and we'll leave the Jamboard open so you can kind of go back and continue to add it, and we'll be, you know, going through this and looking at this and following up with folks as well, in case there's ways that we can help to tell their story. Yeah, I like that. Alyssa didn't know through the court system, open justice. That's a great one. Yeah, this is great. So I want to keep an eye on time. So let's go ahead and we'll go back to the presentation. So we've got our character that we've been thinking about. And the next thing we want to talk about is context. And context is really important, because a lot of times we may have a character, but we don't put them in a time and place, or we don't situate them in an environment where we really can understand what their motivation is. So here you're seeing a picture of school children in Korea who are actually working on an open government project, which was citizens recommending things that the government could work on. So they are obviously with the mask on, we're during the pandemic. So their, you know, context was they were at school, but at home, and seeing all of these meal kit food services coming in with this free dried ice and other things to keep it cool. And what they decided to do was they wanted to invent a way to encourage the government to recycle that ice. So this is the story about how they did that and how they advocated and how government made change. So that's just an important part of the story, is to talk about what those kids' motivations was, and to make sure that they're in the context of where they are. It's during the pandemic. This is what they're seeing, and what is happening. So context, if you go to the next slide, I think of it as kind of the backdrop of your story. And when you think about it for a global audience, and we'll show an example of this. Actually, go to the next slide. I'll go ahead and show it. So we had a story from Italy, and I'm sure we all have different impressions of Italy when we think about it. But here, you know, we had a story about Alessandria, but we didn't want to just say Italy because she's actually in one of the poorer regions in Italy and in Europe. And the challenge there is young people finding work in the region. So it was important for us not just to say the name of the town, but also to talk about what are some of the qualities of it. So this can also work in different ways. You know, are you in a green environment, a dense urban environment? What are some of the characteristics of the context that your character sits in that you want to make sure are in the front part of the story, so you can really sort of develop what their motivations are. So I'm going to go to the second Jamboard here. And so I want you to think about who the character was that you were, the organization or group, and then what would you write about the context they were in, the location they were in, what was happening at that time that may be motivated, if it's a reformer to make the reform, a citizen to get involved in audits, was there a problem in the schools or health systems not getting delivered? I know we did a story during COVID about citizens not seeing money that was promised to them as COVID response being delivered. So that's why they got involved in some of the citizen audience programs. So we'll just take a few minutes here. And you can talk about what you would think would be the context for your character.
And if you're still on the first board, you can just switch between them using the little arrows at the top of your screen to get to context.
Great, thanks, Maya. Give everyone a minute to think that through. So context again, where is your character and why are they there at this moment in time? You know, some other examples from stories that we've worked on. We did a story, I believe it was Moldova, Marissa, correct me if I'm wrong, where they had actually worked on some prescription pricing reforms to increase transparency and lower the costs, which in itself was an interesting story. But we looking at the context of what was going on at that time, it was also how did they then adjust that system for COVID? So the story really is about this character who at this time saw this big need with COVID's response. And then use this existing system. So the story in that way had some more, as Rowan said earlier, had a little more urgency to it and a little more things that people could relate to. Yeah, it's a good example there. Yeah, I like that. I mean, one of the quotes that I've often used when we're talking about brand, as Rowan mentioned, is, you know, a brand is a promise, a good brand is a promise delivered. So I think the storytelling and what we're doing can really, in this example, for example, show how the promise of the government or the civil society organization, it can really help you there. I like that Kenya's devolved structure makes it possible to influence policy. Yeah, that's great. We actually have be on the lookout a op-ed coming out on similar issues in Ukraine and what's happening there as well.
This one's clearly a little bit harder for people to
Yeah,
put
let's go
something
ahead.
down.
I mean, we'll actually are reading through all of your submissions and we'll come back to you all some of the ideas and other things for this. But let's, for the sake of time, go ahead and move to the next C, or the next element, which is conflict. And I'll turn this over to Marissa.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so we'll dig into conflict. This photo is from one of our videos we did on a project in Kaduna, Nigeria. And it's really about having citizens be the eyes and ears of policy, of reforms happening in their community, monitoring infrastructure projects. So, in a picture like this, it's pretty clear to see a conflict. You see this collapsing roof on a building, but how do you translate that into a story and go from there? So we'll talk. If you go to the next slide, Maya, we'll dig into a bit of what conflict is. So conflict, is a key part of every story. So in the context of an OpenGov story, it's really kind of the societal issue you're working on and, that you're trying to solve through OpenGov approaches. So for that last story, it was, the issue was that there were clinics that weren't being built or that were damaged. And, that was, of course, an important part of public service delivery for the community. So they wanted to find a way to be able to monitor these projects and ensure that they had the, better services that in their community. So if, as Stephanie called, context is kind of this backdrop of your story. So then conflict is really almost the backbone of it. So it's, operating in that context and with those characters, what is actually the challenge that you're trying to overcome. And hopefully in the OpenGov context, solving this conflict will actually lead to some sort of change in your community. So the way in storytelling that this is often really useful is, using the conflict to help connect with others. In our case, the OpenGov community, we span all around the world. We tackle many different issues across different languages and contexts, but there are a lot of issues that, we always say at OGP, good ideas can come from anywhere. Like Mexico can learn from Malawi. There's a wide range of, we cover a large range of areas, but there's a lot of ways that we can actually learn from each other, even if it seems like we may come from different backgrounds. And so really, this is a key part when you're telling your OpenGov story, is really connecting with the reader through this conflict. And I think that's something, we often find challenging for folks. It's kind of just jumping straight to the policy reform and, the implementation of it and how you're working on this. But it's really great if you can actually kind of dig into why this is a challenge based on your context, and, what impact it's having on the community by not having the reform you're trying to implement in place. You can go to the next slide, Maya. So this is just a quick screen grab from our video that Stephanie introduced earlier on Mabel in Argentina. And, this is kind of an example of a conflict that was pretty clear. There were protests about gender equality in the streets, and, that started leading to work for gender reforms. But it's, it can be something like this where there's a conflict, a protest that started, and it's a very kind of clear quote, actual conflict. And then Maya, if you'll go to the next slide. Another example, Stephanie also mentioned this one a bit, our story about Jimmy in Colombia. And, the kind of obvious conflict is, of course, the COVID pandemic, but then digging a bit deeper, the actual conflict in Jimmy's life and in his community was that he felt like, the resources weren't serving his community because they weren't being advocated well. And this is where he really came in as the citizen auditor and monitoring how funding for tackling the pandemic was spent. So sometimes it's as easy, it's more clear as a protest that you can visibly see, and other times it's a little bit more digging deeper into, into the character and how it's impacting them at an individual level. So some things to think about the Jamboard. Now, we don't have to go to it quite yet. Maybe just we can add some ideas and we'll go back into it after the next section, because I know some of these, as we get further, they take a little more time to think through. But, just something to think about is what prompted this project to start, and, what obstacles have you had to overcome? So both from maybe the beginning of when you were implementing the reform, the initial challenge you were trying to tackle, but also the kind of stumbling blocks you encountered along the way. And really just digging into what is your reform actually trying to solve, and maybe any kind of big leaps you've had to make along the way. So just a few questions to get you thinking. Again, the Jamboard's fully open, so feel free to pop along to other questions. And maybe we'll just give folks a minute to do that, and then we'll head into conclusion. If you have any questions throughout, let us know. It looks like we're getting some more ideas for context, so that's great. What about Alyssa living in a poor neighborhood in Buenos Aires? It's not friendly for people with disabilities. Getting some more about education in Georgia. Yeah, these are really great. It's digging into not just the location, but what the actual challenges are, and at a more in-depth level with the characters. Oh, great. We already have one for conflict. Let's see. Residents in Mbare in Zimbabwe are frustrated by the failure of local authorities to collect refuse. And there's resulting health risks from there. So interesting conflict there. I'm curious to hear what reforms are being worked on to tackle that. Another one coming in. Oh, yep, with Jimmy's story, the unfairness and inequality in government spending prompted him to act. That's great. Another one I worked on last year, actually, since we have some North Macedonians on the call. We had one issue where Dennis, who is a member of the Roma community, was discriminated against at a local pool. And we saw how, through the country's building out of kind of their access to justice resources, he was able to work with a local access to justice nonprofit who really helped him get some tools to be able to confront this issue. And they actually were able to have a press conference about it and start, kind of raising the issue that's of discrimination against this community that's been a big problem in the country for a while, kind of elevating it to different levels and getting different levels of government and the community involved in raising that issue and giving citizens greater access to justice. Let's see what else we're getting. And continuing from Alyssa's story. So just accessing through the court system was really complicated. And so being able to just simplify the language and make it more accessible was able to help her. Great, lots of good ones coming in. We can head back to the slides for conclusion. Keep on writing them for the Jamboards as you come to them. I know the presentation or this workshop is short and these ideas take a while to come to fruition. So keep adding them as you think through them. So next, conclusion. And this is maybe an obvious one that, we need a conclusion to end a story, but I think this is one that is often the most challenging to work on in a story. And this, we just have a photo of one of our videos we did last year with Sarah here as a mother who, was seeing different issues at her children's school with not having the right resources they needed to have a good learning environment. So she got involved with the government's auditing process where they looked at, I think, 158 schools across Manila, the metro area. And, we're able to kind of look at all these different elements and see what was missing in schools and how to work on that. And I think, one thing when we were thinking through this piece was, of course, it doesn't have quite a perfect ending yet. We're not to all these schools having the resources that they need, but we do have a model in place for monitoring this. And the program, the Citizen Participatory Audit Program, has been a model for a lot of other governments around the world. And so that's something that's really was really great to see with this story. And one of the reasons we wanted to tell it is that it is spreading and it is inspiring others. So Maya, if you want to go to the next slide. So the conclusion at the heart of it is really, where does this reform stand today? And then also what's next, because we want to kind of keep the audience engaged and, wanting to learn more. So it's really important to share that there's some sort of measurable and meaningful progress. You want to be telling your story at a point where there actually is some sort of turning point towards, towards a change. But we know that in the OpenGov world, it's not always a storybook perfect ending. And a lot of times, these reforms continue on in different iterations, and it's a long process of getting these done. So it doesn't need to be a perfect ending, but it is important that you can share something that's, measurable and meaningful, and something that will actually be really interesting to the audience you're trying to serve. And in the case of, writing a story for the Open Stories platform, that's a global audience. So why should they, going back to kind of what Stephanie was talking about in the context, why should they care about this story? And that's really kind of how you can think about the results. And then another key element is, of course, sharing lessons that you've learned along the way. The OpenGov community is all about sharing these ideas, as we've been saying. So I think it's really great if you can share mistakes you've learned or challenges that you've had, because then maybe someone else will see this, they're working on a similar reform, and they might be able to have, a leg up and not have to go through those same challenges as you did. So tips to make implementation easier, things like that can just be relevant for a global audience are great. And then, of course, a key element of stories always, and a big part of the Open Stories platform, is we want these stories to be igniting hope and motivating the community. We all know that there's very depressing stats out there about democracy and how, all these different freedoms are declining around the world. But as OpenGov champions in this group, we're really working to try to counter that narrative and show that through OpenGov approaches, through transparency, through accountability, through participation and inclusion, we can actually, counter that change and bring strong democracy to citizens. So, really thinking about the larger context that your reform is operating in is important for the conclusion to kind of connect with your readers. And next slide, Maya. And this example is just from one of our stories from South Africa. And we had, there's a quote here from Zuki just talking about how, they worked side by side with the government to host all these data quests and hackathons, because their goal of their reform was really to open up budget data and get citizens to better understand the data. But when that is, in these really complicated spreadsheets or behind different walls that it's hard for citizens and civic actors to get through, that of course makes it challenging. So it was really cool to see the kind of innovative ways through these data quests and hackathons that they were, able to accomplish their goal in that. So going back to the Jamboard and your stories, just, thinking through what kind of concrete changes can you share about this work? And where is this work headed next? What outcomes you hope can still be achieved through this work? I know this one's a bigger one, so we can give you some time to think about it. And while you're doing that, I'll just mention we'll close with a quick slide about kind of craft and just some tips to think through when you are working on your stories. And we also have a short presentation from Isabelle from Integrity Action, and she's a member of our OpenGov Comms network. So she'll share a little bit about how this has worked in practice for her as well.
Yeah, why don't we actually, Marissa, why don't we actually go to Isabelle, so she can talk about, kind of how she's worked through this similar system and how it's worked for her. I think an example might be helpful.
Yeah, take it away, Isabelle.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Isabelle from Integrity Action. I don't have much time, I realise, but I'm just going to share a couple of insights about the work we do. I just dropped our link in the chat there, and I'm going to open my presentation. Let me do that now. Hope everyone's having a good day so far, whatever the time of day is where you are. Okay, so I hope this is working. So yeah, what makes a good Open Gov story? I'll just tell you a little bit about what Integrity Action does. We work with communities to monitor what was promised against what's been delivered, and that is in regard to essential services and projects. And then the communities also work with those who are responsible to get the problems fixed. So at the moment, that's done quite a lot through a mobile app called Development Check, which means we have data about what the problems are and what the fixes are. So I'm just going to skip through these first slides really quickly because I think a lot of it's been covered, but I feel like some of it might still be interesting. And the main elements which Stephanie and Marissa have been talking about that need to be considered to craft a story, some of these things that I've listed here might help you along the way. So, you know, you might have photos or videos.
Isabelle, sorry to interrupt. I don't think we're seeing your slides yet.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh, my goodness. Thank you for telling me. I don't know why that didn't work.
There we go. There will show up in a second now. Yep. I think.
Can you see the, yeah. Is it working?
It's saying you started the screen sharing. You need to enter the full screen mode, I think. You may. Okay.
Okay, hold on. Let me try something else. Sorry.
No problem.
Is that working? Okay, you know what? We tested this and it worked.
No problem. Let me just open them now and you can keep talking.
What time is that working now?
Ah, there we go. Now it's showing up. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry, everybody, about that. So I was just saying, yeah, right. So the kind of things that you might need to know as you're approaching the story, in addition to what has been mentioned already by Stephanie and Marissa, the kind of data basically, or the kind of elements you might want to gather, which might be available to you, and you might have to dig a little bit. It could be photos, videos, voice recordings. It could be reports and program data that I mentioned. You could have quotes from the people involved. So that could be duty bearers, those responsible. It could also be from the community or activists. You could have more in-depth accounts. And then one thing which we also talk about a bit is making sure you have some consent to share the story, and also especially if you have photos. You should also think about why it's interesting to the audience. This has been touched upon already. And then you might need to take time to gather more information. These are some questions. So for us, because we're working with citizen monitors and looking at how projects and services are delivered in comparison to what was promised, these are the kind of questions we might be asking. Have there been tangible improvements in community members' lives? Have attitudes changed? Have services changed? Have policies changed? Has there been increased trust? Are the relationships better? Are there any outcomes that weren't expected? Because that could be, although it might not be something that the program was aiming to do, it might have happened anyway, and it might have been positive. And then looking back at what was achieved against what was planned, and you can draw out interesting stories even if a program is partway through. I realize these questions might be very specific to my organization specifically, but hopefully they'll be a bit interesting and inspirational. And then, of course, you want to bring together the key insights. So in this case, I'm talking about a specific initiative that we were running in Kenya, and I was the one pasting those examples in the workshopping we did just now about Kwale in Kenya. So citizen monitors were looking at how projects and services were delivered and then engaging with those responsible. So you might want to think about, why is this important to people's lives? What are the key insights? What have we learned? What have we achieved? And then also, why are we telling this story? What do we want to do with this story? Who do we want to reach? we want to show the impact we've had? Do we want to get interest from donors or new partners? Is it going to feed into some kind of policy change, hopefully? And profile raising, which was also mentioned earlier today, you know, people aren't going to listen to us if we don't have a profile. So, and then, as I mentioned before, some practical considerations. It can take time. It can take longer than you expect. You have to be flexible. You might discover things you weren't expecting. You know, if you have data that you want to turn into a story, data cleaning and data analysis can take time. And so in our case, what happens is promises made to a community. It could be that they're going to have a new clinic built. Citizen monitors use the app to report problems, and then they work with the duty bearers to engage and find a way to solve the problems together. That the story I'm talking about briefly focuses on is in Kenya, like I mentioned, or delayed. So we are working with partner organisations. We're directly working with citizen monitors there, and this is one of them. She's called Mbodze. So the kind of insights we were finding were that the volume of problems being reported was the highest at the beginning, and as the program went on, you know, problems being reported fewer, but fixes were coming through and that had been resolved was increasing. So overall, the program was contributing to getting problems fixed. And another type of insight that we got was that one of the major obstacles to getting problems fixed was when the community couldn't access the project documents, or for example, it could be a patient charter or a bill of quantities. So that's one of the, you know, that's one of the insights that we got. I'm keeping this quite light touch because I know I don't have much time, but essentially, and also I'd like to share this presentation afterwards in case anyone wants to, you know, read it without me running through it. But yeah, once you have the key story points and the key insights, you just have to order them in a way that makes sense. It might not be the exact chronological way that it happened. Storyboarding can help, as was mentioned earlier as well, what we're talking about. Think about what open stories can do to help you show the story that you want to tell in terms of showing multimedia and so on. And here's a link I've added that I'll also paste in the chat, which is about using subheadings and how subheadings can help the reader to, you know, keep moving through your story. I think I might have run out of time, so if I have, please tell me and I can just wrap it
Isabelle,
up.
I think this is great. If you just want to wrap up, and we'll make sure that we share this with everyone.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, fine. So we used it. So there's just showing like a couple of screen grabs from our story. We used a platform called Adobe Creative Cloud, but we're also going to be using the, like, what it looks like. And, you know, we kind of linked up the insights we had with graphs and with quotes and with stats, as you can see here. And then also here we had some quotes from the local authorities that kind of contradicted the data we had. So we dug into that a little bit, you know. Various challenges can come along the way, and you just have to prepare for them. So,
no, sorry, Isabelle, you were breaking up a little bit on my end, but I think one thing I want to point out that she said is Adobe Creative Cloud. There are a lot of free resources out there and things that
I'm going to paste some links in, and please feel free.
Yeah, and some stuff. So we'll, as part of the survey and continued conversations that we hope to have with this group, we'll be making sure to share those out there as we find them. We do have the OpenGov Communicators Network. We'll send a note in the survey on how to join if you are not already engaged in that. But this was a lot for an initial conversation, but I hope it gave people some insight. And we really do want to keep the conversation going and share the different tools and tips and things that we all are working on, because I think the whole community can benefit from it. So with that, we're just a couple minutes over, so I can stay around for a few seconds. Our team can if there's some other questions, but otherwise we'll continue to be in touch. So thank you all for joining this. I think we've got morning, afternoon, and maybe some even evenings in here as well. So thanks, everyone.